I'm Tom Morello, and you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hello.
And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello. Get ready. We're trying to break new ground here.
That's right, Ralph. In recent years, Republicans have tried all manner of voter suppression, demanding voter ID, limiting polling places, fighting mail-in voting. We've covered many of these tactics on past programs. In an election year where we are told that our very democracy is at stake, what are the Democrats doing to counter that? The overall Democratic Party election strategy on the national level seems to be controlled by high-priced consultants who spend most of their money on TV commercials. And on the state level, the party is preoccupied with turning out already registered Democrats. Our guest today, Jason Berlin, argues that what the Democratic Party is missing these days is a serious effort to register people who will most likely vote for Democrats. Jason is the co-founder of Field Team 6, a group that identifies potential Democratic voters in purple, flippable states, and through their quote-unquote proudly partisan voter drives, works to register them to vote. We'll speak to him about how Field Team 6's efforts fit into the Democratic Party's broader work to turn elections in their favor. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our tireless corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, how are Democrats born? Does the stork bring them? David?
Jason Berlin is a former TV writer and co-founder of Field Team 6, a national voter registration project that organizes voter drives to register Democrats in the most flippable states across the country. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Jason Berlin.
Thank you so much. So happy to be here.
Yes, Jason, let's start with a brief discussion on how you can be put out of business. In Canada, people are registered as a result of the census. They don't have to be begged to register or tried to be located to register. It's done generically. People in this country have to be begged to vote. In Australia, it's a universal duty. You don't have to spend as a candidate money on TV urging people to turn out to vote or to come to vote. It's a civic duty. Have you thought of putting yourself out of business in those two ways so that you don't have to spend your time going one at a time to register people? I know there's some states that have same-day registration when you vote, but they're in the distinct minority. And there is an attack by the GOP largely on voter rights, and it includes mishandling and distorting the voter registration process, which in some states can be very, very formidable. Tell us, are you advocating as an aside the Canadian and Australian type reforms?
Okay, that is a super insightful question. And yes, as you know, every organizer's goal is to organize themselves out of a job. So yes, that's not where we are yet. We're not within striking distance of that yet, but eventually, absolutely yes is the answer. I don't say we should do a lot of things like South Dakota does in general, but in South Dakota, there is no voter registration. In Canada, the model you're talking about is fantastic. Universal voter registration. Australia's model for mandatory voting is also terrific. We would love to move towards that eventually, for sure. But the idea of voter registration itself is suppression, as you know, and came out of that attempt. So really, we're trying to, register Democrats, save the world is our stated mission at Field Team 6.
I just want to head off some acerbic comments from our listeners. When Jason used the word mandatory voting in Australia, you can go and vote for anybody. You don't have to vote for the candidates on the ballot. You can write in your vote. You can vote for yourself. You can vote for your Aunt Maisie. You just have to register your vote. And if you don't, and you don't have an excuse, it's just a modest $20 fine, which goes into the election fund, just to clarify that. Now, you have pioneered a form of voter registration. We're familiar with people with clipboards on campus trying to register voters as they're strolling by. We're familiar with motor vehicle voter registration, where when you go your motor vehicle license, you get registered. Phone banks. But you're doing it in an extremely efficient way, one at a time on the iPhone. You want to describe that?
Absolutely. Yes. While we still do in-person voter drives with clipboards on college campuses and at courthouses all over, that does represent a tiny fraction of our work. Since COVID forced us to go digital, we started this one-of-a-kind database that's unique in the country that has millions of unregistered people who are likely Democrats. And we reach out to them and register them in every nonviolent way possible. We do it through email and text, and those are super effective. We do it through phone banking and postcarding. Those are also effective, and we need all of the above methods because there are some people who you can only reach in one method. For example, postcarding, we only send people postcards for whom we only have a postal address. So there's no other way to reach them. But we have a no Democrat left behind philosophy. So we make sure they get the touch that we can give to them. Field Team 6 is the one and only national organization doing partisan voter registration in swing states and districts across the country where just a few votes can change election outcomes. We do that all year.
And your website is very clear here. You say Field Team 6 is a partisan voter registration specialist that delivered 1.57 million new blue and purple registrants and 2/3 of a million new votes in the 2022 midterm election. It's the
That's right.
largest scale and lowest cost ever seen in progressive organizing in this field. You pulled out 2/3 of a million new votes. And you know, if Donald Trump got 100,000 votes in several swing states, more than he did in 2020, he'd have been reelected. So 2/3 of a million new votes is not inconsequential in this terrible electoral college system we have that can defy the national popular vote. So what do you
You're
mean by purple registrants?
oh,
Blue, I think you're looking for Democrats. What do you mean by purple?
blue and purple meaning Democratic and independent voters. Yes. And you're exactly right about the Electoral College. Most people aren't aware of this, that in 2016, Trump won by 77,000 votes across 3 states that tipped the Electoral College. And similarly, in 2020, Biden Harris won by 43,000 votes nationally, an even tinier, razor thin margin than those 43,000 votes were the total of what tipped Arizona, Wisconsin, and Georgia, which won Biden Harris the election. So
Even though they landslided Trump in the national popular vote by what?
exactly, by many
Seven,
millions of
7
votes.
million?
Yep, it was 7 million.
Well,
Yes.
what do you
So
got for
adding 600.
2024?
Oh, we
Tell
are
us about
planning.
2024.
We are so far since our start in 2019, we have delivered 2.3 million new blue and purple voters, independent and Democratic voters. We are planning on adding at least 3 million more voters by November, 62 days from now. And that is voters who we have registered this 2-year cycle. So we are firing on all cylinders right now. We are holding a million text march every Saturday. We're sending out at least 1 million texts a week. Texts are one of the most effective ways of registering people. Same with emails. With emails in the 22 midterms, we had a 40% yield. 40% of the people we emailed registered as Democrats or independents. With text, we had a 30% yield. That is staggering. Those numbers are off the charts.
I think our listeners might ask this question now. It's one thing to register voters. How do you get them to actually turn out and vote?
Yes, we also do get out the vote efforts, but to put this in perspective, the kind of given wisdom handed down from the heavens is that is that it all comes down to turnout. And while turnout is absolutely critical, I'm not talking trash about turnout. We got to get out the vote, of course. 99% of the resources, volunteers, and donors go to getting out the vote. About 1% go to voter registration. That is a huge imbalance, and we will win more elections if we put more resources into voter registration, which feeds that beast. You know, all campaigns are not all, but the vast majority. Some work with us, but the vast majority do not do any voter registration. They're exclusively focused on getting out the vote. Same with the party at every level from national to local. Same with most grassroots groups. And the fact is you can't get out the vote if those voters don't exist to begin with. So it's like no one had to talk with people about where a voter comes from. So we concentrate on that first half of the equation, generating, getting people over that biggest hurdle, getting them registered, generating this river of new Democrats and independents who can then get into the system and be targeted by the massive get out the vote machinery.
Are you remonstrating with the Democratic National Committee to get them to focus more on voter registration? Do they return your calls? Are they friendly with you? What's the relationship?
They are friendly, and yet it is a calcified system, and there's the political industrial complex, and money usually goes where it has gone in the past, and a lot of that, millions of dollars, go to ad buys that are there and gone, while what we leave in our wake are new blue voters, the human infrastructure in these swing states and districts who will push these areas bluer over time. So while campaigns fight for a vote, we fight for a voter who will give them that vote, but also vote for Dems up and down the ballot, some of them for the rest of their lives.
Well, let's put it this way. The Democratic Party over the years has exhibited serious symptoms of masochism, like they've written off half the country, where they don't even compete, red state, blue state. There have been books written on their blunders, all the elections, unable to landslide the worst GOP in history, barely winning elections and not being able to be workable because one or two senators can block a program. And we know this. Now, when you try to get the Democratic Party to redirect some of their hundreds of millions of dollars that are pouring in into very rational voter registration turnout strategies, do they return your calls? Do you talk to Senator Gary Peters, who's trying to save the Senate for the Democrats, or the DCCC in the House? Do they return your calls, or do they defy the principle that none of us are as smart as all of us?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that principle. They sometimes return calls. I would love to speak to Senator Peters. I would love for us to get funding from the DNC, absolutely, and work with them, not just for money, but just as partners. That said, we do have over 200 partners we work with, mainly grassroots organizations across the country. A lot of the grassroots national infrastructure that blossomed in the wake of Trump's election and that has become the resistance, the progressive movement for this last 8 years. And I do want to say that we work with county Democratic parties all over the country, small Democratic clubs, as well as lots of grassroots groups. And the great majority of our funding is from grassroots groups and individual activist donors, many of whom are also volunteers with us and with other organizations. So our national organization's budget is $3 million for this 2-year cycle. And that is to deliver 3 million new voters. We have it down to staggeringly low $1 a voter because we are a volunteer army. There are only 3 people on paid staff at Field Team 6, including me. We are now up to over 26,000 volunteers. That's why we're able to do this.
What you're saying, Jason, is truly beyond amazing. Are you getting the close cooperation of the Progressive Democrats of America, which is sort of the progressive wing of young people?
We're not working directly with them. No, we may be working with a chapter or two. I have to, we're constantly updating our partner organization list. I would have to check. We might actually be working with a chapter or two of them across the country. But yes, we work with indivisible chapters all the time and swing left chapters and individual grassroots groups that just spring up, Indivisible Tucson Action Alliance, Raging Grannies. Yeah, just wonderful grassroots groups who, by the way, I should mention, this entire resistance movement across the country is about 85% women. That's a story that's usually not told.
I've come out with a book called Let's Start the Revolution, but it could have been titled Why the Democrats Blunder and Lose Their Elections. It's full of advice, and it never occurred to me to include your work because I didn't know about it. And I usually, watch these things very carefully. You might want to look at the book and see if it offers any opportunities for you. You mentioned earlier you also deal with independent voters?
Yes, absolutely. So lots of, and this has been the case for decades, I think. Lots of young people register as independents. Independent has a great sound to it. It's a real value, especially for young people. They want to be independent. No label can describe the complexity that is me, and also they don't want to be there's disaffection with the both parties and some real legit feelings surrounding that. So yes, we absolutely also register independents. If an independent is going to be caucusing with Democrats, approaches us and wants our help registering Democrats, absolutely, we will absolutely do that. Or another example, Dan Osborne, who is running for Senate in Nebraska and mind-blowingly is about 1 point behind the Republican candidate right now in a statewide race for Senate. He's an independent. If you go to his website, there could not be more red on a website. He's wearing a red shirt, Navy man. It says it's the first, line. It's in a military slash college football font. It could not look more Republican. And it says independent for US Senate. And he is running a really smart campaign on progressive values, but framed in Republican words.
We're talking with Jason Berlin, who started this remarkable, inexpensive, volume oriented registration drive using the latest technology. I mean, $1 a voter registered. I mean, who can beat that? Is the GOP taking notice and they're saying, hey, we got smart people too. We're going to do what Jason's doing?
Not yet. They, in general, attack from the air. They're the party with all the money, usually, and they blanket the airwaves. And their ground game usually falls flat compared to the left. They don't approach it the same way. In their defense, which is a weird phrase to ever use about the other side, but in their defense, they all get registered. They are great at voter registration. They have not had the problem that we do. A part of that, of course, is 60% of people who are not registered have never been asked. That's from a Pew study. And a lot of the people who don't get asked are in lower income brackets, the Democrats and independents, a lot of them. So that is our opportunity and our job. We ask, we meet them where they are on their phones, with texts, on their computers, with emails, or with postcards, phone calls, in-person voter drives, and ask and register them. So yeah, Republicans are really good at registration already, and we have to press our advantage with this ground game.
And how do you bridge this gap from registering voters and then getting them to actually vote?
We are sending out get out the vote emails to every single person in our database that we have been part of registering, or who has registered on their own. That our database is now up to, including registered voters. I believe we're going to have about 20 million unregistered likely Democrats in our database in the next few weeks, which is huge. And including the registered voters, our database is like 34 million or so. So that's about 10% of America. We are going to email everyone for whom we have an email. And as I was talking about before, there already exists this vast get out the vote machinery. Every level of the party, every campaign is pretty much exclusively devoted to that. So our getting these people who are invisible now when they're unregistered, they don't get all the texts and emails that we do because they're not registered. They're kind of forgotten. So we bring them into the fold so that they can get all of these reminders to go vote. 85% of registered voters vote in a presidential election. That's a very high number. That suggests the importance of voter registration. Also, young people, we've all heard 23% of them turn out to vote. But in 2020, among registered 18 to 24-year-olds, 86% of them voted. That also reinforces the idea that the simple act of registration turns people into super voters, and that is really where the biggest emphasis should be.
That's interesting. The estimate is that this year, 80 million eligible voters, 18 and up, are not going to vote, which is one of the lowest estimates. They expect a big turnout. Let me ask you something that I always ask people who break new ground like this. Your work is visible, efficient, timely, and, shall we say, successful. And it's critical to this election year. So just answer yes or no. Have you been interviewed by NPR?
No.
Have you been interviewed by PBS?
No.
Have you been interviewed by the New York Times?
No.
Have you been interviewed by the Wall Street Journal?
Mm-mm. No.
Have you been interviewed by the Washington Post?
Also no.
Have you been interviewed by AP, Associated Press?
No.
Have you been interviewed by Reuters?
Nope. Have not.
Have you been interviewed by the Los Angeles Times, where you live, and you have a pet squirrel called Daisy?
You knew that. You knew that. It was.
Objection, Ralph. You're badgering the witness.
I just, wow.
Have
I
you been
haven't thought
interviewed by
about Daisy in
the
a long time.
Los Angeles Times?
No, have not.
You see, listeners, you see what I'm talking about?
You have the scoop.
The
National.
dereliction of our press, even public radio and PBS, case rested. Steve?
Thank you, Ralph. Jason, I'm interested in your transformation from TV writer to forming a nonprofit organization. Why?
Good question. I was a TV writer for 18 years, wrote for comedy and reality, a little bit of animation, and loved my career, but was always a political junkie. Then Trump got elected, and that broke my mind and heart. And I could no longer write for Sharktacular, the Shark Week preview special with Eli Roth. It just was too much cognitive dissonance. And I just needed to get into the fight all day, every day. I went to my first activist meeting. It was in February 2017, after the coma of mourning the election loss had starting to wear off a little. And just being in a room packed with other people who felt as insane as I did, felt like the only place I could really be sane. And I just looked around the room and realized I love all these strangers who have taken the time to come to this room and meet other strangers, because we all know something has to change and we have to fight this, and we don't even know how, but we're going to figure it out. And that was life changing. I started organizing and realizing organizing is just volunteering, but more so. And I could weaponize my extroversion. And it's just a matter of how many calls can you make, Zooms can you have, emails can you send, coffees can you have with people, and connect different people doing good work, amplify each other's work, and get connected to this network of invisible angels across the country who no one knows exists, but we have been the invisible hand winning elections for these past 8 years. Since Trump won in that loophole, it's been pretty much a nonstop string of against the odds victories, from flipping the House in 2018 by almost twice the number we needed to flip the House, to, exiling the fast food fascist to Mar-a-Lago in 2020 and restoring the Democratic trifecta. And then in 22, turning what was supposed to be a red wave into more of a rosé spritz against all odds, holding the Senate and increasing our majority there by 1. So yeah, it was that. What changed my life was the alchemistry equation of the idea that you could turn all your grief and rage channel that into positive conversations with strangers and create real change. And in the case of voter registration, it's even quantifiable, so you can compete against yourself and others. That's crucial. That really makes it fun, the metrics.
Jason, before we go to David, tell our listeners your website, and we'll repeat it again before we conclude, so they can connect more with you.
Thank you. Yes, it is fieldteam6.org. It's a play on SEAL Team 6, who got bin Laden, because we're the crack voter registration group who goes behind enemy lines in these purple states and districts and does the impossible. Fieldteam6.org.
Fieldteam6.org, listeners. David?
My question reflects what many people believe. Not me, I don't believe this, but I know too many Democrats who quietly believe this, especially hyper-educated Democrats. So I don't believe this, but I'm going to ask the question. So it was received wisdom that the larger the voter turnout, the better Democrats do. Did Donald Trump change that dynamic? Are we absolutely certain more registered voters, especially in battleground states, guarantee a Democratic victory? Also, and this is what I've heard hyper-educated Democrats say, given the paucity of serious news media that Ralph just talked about, given the lack of civic engagement, given how little too many Americans, given how little they understand how the three branches of government work, shouldn't we be fixing our schools, teaching civics before we make it easier to vote? Otherwise, we run the danger of electing another Trump or running candidates like Kamala Harris, who's short on specifics right now for fear of alienating low information Democrats.
That is a beefy question. You pay attention, and yes, you are right. The increase in turnout in recent years has not just across the board helped Democrats as history taught us to expect. You're right. The turnout has been high on both sides in these last 8 years. And the remedy, really, to my mind, is registering more Democrats. It makes this partisan voter registration even more important. There's been a lot written this year alone about how nonpartisan voter registration efforts often net more Republicans than otherwise, than, Democrats and independents. And that's super dangerous. While a lot of people on our side primarily say you have to register everybody. Actually, ironically, if you believe in registering people to vote, you should not be registering Republicans because they don't. And they are actively attacking every phase in the life cycle of a voter, from registering to voting to certification afterwards. So at this point in our history, it is existential and could not be more necessary to register Democrats and progressive independents. We definitely need to, you talked about the education system and the lack of proper civics education, and that could not be more important. I feel like Trump's election was to a huge extent the result of systemic lack of support for education over decades. Thriving democracy relies on an informed electorate. So I don't think we should wait another second to educate people before we empower them. It needs to be both, everything, everywhere, all at once. And by electing more Democrats, of course, we will be able to prioritize education and make sure money is not being drained out of public education by these voucher systems and stuff like that. And just make sure that we can elect more progressive people over time. It's not a coincidence that educated people skew Democratic. It's not just some demographic anomaly. There's a reason for that. So, and it's not indoctrination. It might just be that they know more. They got a chance to encounter other ideas and perspectives and religions and sexual orientations and have a more balanced view of other people that's not as fear driven.
Yeah. And the empire. I mean, you've got a big sequence. You first register, then you got to get in the vote, then you got to get people to vote with mandates. So their vote comes with purpose, with policy, with performance, with evaluation subsequent to the election. Nobody said democracy is easy. As I've said, the only place where democracy comes before work is in the dictionary. Before we go to Hannah, Jason, have you been on Amy Goodman's Democracy Now?
I love her. I have not.
Are you in touch with Ari Berman, the progressive writer on voter rights?
No, I am not. I would love to be.
Okay. Hannah?
Jason, in your 2021-2022 cycle impact report, you mentioned this before, you say that your outreach directly led to 660,000 new voters. I'm not seeing how you determined that. Is it just correlation, or do you have any post-election polling to demonstrate an actual causal link? You determine those statistics.
Yes. So after an election, we take our database and we have the information for everyone we reached out to in all the different ways: email, text, postcard, phone. And we compare that to the updated 50 state voter rolls. So we do have to wait a few months after an election for all the secretaries of state to update their voter rolls. We raise the money to get access to those voter rolls and then compare them to our database and see, out of all the people we reached out to, who registered, what party in the 33 states that report party affiliation, and who voted. So that's when we get the teacher's edition, when we get the answers, see how we did. As far as correlation versus causation, that is a great, smart question. So we can say we reached out to these people, they got registered, and that's correlation. If you want to talk about causation in a statistical way, we did a comparison study. It was not an RCT, randomized controlled trial. We're actually doing one of those right now on our work in this cycle that we're very excited about. But we did a large scale comparison study and treating the group that we reached out to as the treatment group, 5 million people we reached in 22. And there was another 7.2 million people in our database whom we did not reach. We did a group to get too far into the weeds here, but treated them as the de facto kind of control group and found there was a 6.6 point jump in registration among the people that we contacted. That's off the charts. A 3-point improvement is cause for dancing in the streets, usually for an organization. So 6.6 point jump in registration is huge. And there was also a 2.9 point increase in voting.
Can I jump into the weeds with you? Is that controlled for other factors? Is it control for other determining factors that would make someone more likely to register between the two groups?
What we did, and this is at the very edge of things I should ever be talking about, just given I'm not a statistician, but we have a volunteer analytics team. I didn't know those words could go together, but it's kind of a volunteer Manhattan project. They're super geniuses. It includes a nuclear physicist, 2 PhD statisticians, one known as the data god of USC. People you don't usually think of when you think of volunteers, but they ran a bootstrap analysis. They ran millions of iterations, comparing random pick in the de facto control group to another random pick in the de facto treatment group, and found there was no difference qualitatively between these two groups. In other words, it's kind of a backwards looking thing that makes it similar to an RCT in the final analysis. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's
Okay.
I think neither of us are statisticians, so thank you for explaining the controls as much as we can.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we are doing an RCT right now and can't wait for the results of that, but that won't be until sometime in probably spring 25.
Well, before we conclude, we've been speaking with Jason Berlin, who started this group, Field Team 6. Jason, not only give the website again, but what can people expect to learn from the website and to be engaged?
Yes. Fieldteam6.org is our website. The word field, the word team, and the number 6.org. And I have to say, every time I ever speak to anyone, we need you. We are volunteer driven, so we need volunteers and donors. That's how we get all our good done. We are a machine for minting Democrats. Your volunteer hours and donor dollars are the fuel. So on our website, you can find under volunteer ops is that first choice. You can see all the different ways to volunteer, from postcarding to texting to in-person voter drives to social media storming. Lots of this you can do from wherever you are in the country. Most of our opportunities are remote. So if you're in a blue state or city, you can help out in a purple place like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada, North Carolina, Georgia. Did I leave one out? Probably. Montana, Ohio. We need those two for the Senate. New York and California, we're in 6 swing districts in each of those states because we need those to take back the House. So volunteer with us. The donate button is right at the top of the front page. Everything helps. Every dollar is a voter. Every $1,000 allows us to text 25,000 people. That's hugely effective. So
Is your website devoid of policy agendas? It's just strictly antiseptic and focusing on voter registration and get out the vote in swing states, especially?
While antiseptic is not the word I would use for yes, we registered Democrats Save the World is right at the top of the website because that is our mission. Because we know that whether the cause closest to your heart is abortion rights or LGBTQ plus rights or workers' rights or saving democracy itself, the only way to push all of these things forward is by electing more Democrats, and registering Democrats is the most direct way to do that.
Well, don't be surprised if in the coming days you're going to get calls from the mainstream press. Don't be
I would love
surprised.
that. I would love
We've
that
been-
so much. We need it.
Very good. Thank you very much. We've been talking with Jason Berlin, who started this group a few years ago called Field Team 6. You would think that political scientists would be banging on his door to see how he's revolutionizing the efficiency and speed and precision of voter registration in the United States, while he and others wait for a system where people are generically registered to vote as they are in Canada and some other countries. Thank you very much, Jason.
Thank you so much for having me.
We've been speaking with Jason Berlin. We will link to Field Team 6 at ralphnaderradiohour.com. All right, so that was Jason Berlin. Let's do a little postmortem here. I want to ask Hannah, David, Ralph, what surprised and or impressed you about that presentation? David, why don't you go first?
Well, I was impressed by how he answered my question. A lot of guests have stock answers. They always revert back to their default talking point. I had what I thought was a complicated question, and he answered all parts of it. I wish politicians would do the same. He really addressed my concerns. I think he's articulate, and he's not arrogant. He knows his stuff, and very impressed by him.
Ralph, what do you think of this?
Well, I've heard enough from him to warrant wider news coverage of it. Given the coverage every day in the press of the candidates, their personalismo dimensions, how they coached football in high school, and what kind of food they like to eat, what he's put on the table is enough meat and potatoes, as they used to say, to warrant features and interviews on the mainstream media. If anything, it will pay attention to new and traditional techniques to register voters with new and old technology, the personal touch with the clipboard, and the kind of mechanisms that he developed to reach people ever more efficiently in getting them to register.
Up next, Ralph is going to answer a couple of your listener questions. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, September 6, 2024. I'm Russell Mokhiber. California lawmakers have voted to ban food additives linked to behavioral issues in kids from school lunchrooms. That's according to a report from CBS News. That means snacks like Flaming Hot Cheetos, Twinkies, and more will no longer be allowed in school cafeterias across the state. Stores may still sell the food products, though, under the first-of-its-kind legislation. The ingredients include food dyes Blue 1, Blue 2, Green 3, Red 40, Yellow 5, and Yellow 6, which give colors to snacks like Doritos, Fruit Loops, and Fruity Pebbles cereals, and Jolly Ranchers candy. Advocates for the ban argue the additives have no nutritional value, are used solely for superficial purposes, and can cause health problems. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman, Hannah, Francesco, and the rest of the team, which includes Ralph, of course. Okay, we're going to do some listener questions. This first one we got off our YouTube channel, Ralph, and it comes from somebody who goes by the handle Rompelstomp. And the questioner says, I'm a beginner in politics. I'm trying to learn how to organize my local area. Where do I start? Is there a video series I could watch that could teach me the basics? Is there a book that I need to read or listen to? I've been reaching out to people who support things like mutual aid disaster relief, community groups that do local direct action to help regular people, and even church groups. I live in the Deep South, so it's hard to discuss political issues without making people angry.
Well, then you should read my book, Unstoppable, The Left-Right Alliance to Dismantle the Corporate State. And it shows how many issues on the ground level where people live, work, and raise their families are supported by overwhelming numbers of liberal and conservative voters, like full health care and insurance, a living wage, cracking down on corporate crooks, cleaning out our air and water, good public services. So you can read that book. And then there's all kinds of other manuals, civic action manuals, that you can locate on the website. A shorter book you can read that I did called Breaking Through Power, It's Easier Than We Think. It gives a lot of examples in recent American history where it took a small number of people with good strategies and a good positive can-do attitude to make significant changes nationwide. And a young public interest lawyer, Pete Davis, put out a movie that is perfectly suited to your inquiry. It's called Join or Die, and you can get it by joinorddiefilm.com.
This next question comes to us from Dave Lankuth. Should we demand a firmer stance from Kamala on Gaza, or should we hold our tongues so as not to divide the party so that we can have a better chance of electing her? The polls seem to be in Kamala's favor, but oh, how wrong the polls can be post-2016. The reality I see on the ground is that the cost of living has risen and most Americans' wages have not kept pace.
Well, the slaughter goes on. There's a moral imperative, not just a political imperative, to put a stop to the genocide. The vast majority of the American people realize that this is getting us into bigger risks of a regional war, and she's got to take a stand. Once you start backing off and waffling, it becomes a way of political life. This is the time when she defines her own identity. She is on the side of peace. She's on the side of international law. She's on the side of complying with domestic law. And the polls are growing by the month to demand a ceasefire and a peaceful solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. That is a sign of a leader. If she doesn't do that, she's going to be tarred with the waffling, feeble, weak Joe Biden position that accords itself with the war criminal Netanyahu, who's despised by 3 out of 4 of his own Israeli people. And the biggest demonstrations against him have not been in Europe and the United States. They've been in Israel. If she doesn't define herself that way, she may suffer the fate of Hubert Humphrey. He refused to break with Lyndon Johnson on the Vietnam War, and that made the difference in electing Richard Nixon.
Do you think Ralph Lyndon Johnson suspended the bombing of North Vietnam on November 1st? Do you think if there's a ceasefire, would that make a difference, or has Biden lost too many voters because of Gaza? It's a year long. This is
ceasefire. Yeah, a ceasefire would make a big difference because it comes along with the entry of thousands of humanitarian aid trucks distributing to children, mothers, fathers, grandmothers, grandfathers. Had nothing to do with October 7th. A starving population, and that can only accrue to her benefit to see the news reports and the videos and the social media of these people being saved and trying to rebuild their lives as they weep over their hundreds of thousands of lost friends, relatives, and neighbors by weapons made in America.
Ralph, did you see the interview last week on CNN of Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, and when she was asked this question? And if you did, what did you think of her answer?
No, it wasn't much different except in tone than Joe Biden, which is exactly what the playbook is coming out of the Democratic National Convention. Do not break with Biden, but show a little more passion for the humanitarian needs of the Palestinian people. That didn't mean any policy changes whatsoever.
Yeah, it seems like the playbook is the first thing you need to do is spend 5 minutes decrying what happened on October 7th, and then like 15 seconds saying, however, what's going on there is there needs to be a ceasefire. So I was disappointed. I know that.
That's exactly why a large proportion of people for which this is the number one issue and their own relatives are dying over there, Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, have not budged in their skepticism about Kamala Harris.
And now here's Francesco de Sanchez with In Case You Haven't Heard.
On August 28th, the Israeli Defense Forces targeted United Nations World Food Program vehicles with quote-unquote repeated gunfire, per CNN. According to the agency, quote, despite being clearly marked and receiving multiple clearances by Israeli authorities to approach, the vehicle was directly struck by gunfire as it was moving toward an IDF checkpoint, end quote. Photos show at least 10 bullet holes in the vehicle windows. As this piece highlights, quote, ongoing airstrikes and repeated evacuation orders by Israeli forces have forced many of the agency's food warehouses and community kitchens to shutter. The IDF-designated humanitarian zone in Gaza is also steadily shrinking. In the past month alone, the IDF has reduced the zone by 38%, end quote. This incident is reminiscent of the Israeli strike on World Central Kitchen workers in April, when the IDF killed 3 Britons, a Palestinian, a US-Canadian dual citizen, an Australian, and a Pole via multiple airstrikes. 2 days after the World Food Program incident, CNN reported that the IDF killed 4 in a humanitarian aid vehicle affiliated with the American Near East Refugee Aid Organization. On Monday, the Israeli Labor Federation Histadrut called a general strike in order to, quote, pressure Netanyahu's government into changing its approach to ceasefire negotiations, end quote, per NPR. This action was taken in response to the death of 6 hostages who would have been released had Israel agreed to the ceasefire proposed in early July. According to NPR, quote, many schools and government buildings were shut, and Ben Gurion Airport paused flights for several hours, end quote. Yet Israel's labor court quickly ordered the strike to end, and the union obeyed. The action lasted less than 1 business day. This incident illustrates the deep discontent with the Netanyahu government's handling of the hostage negotiations, but also the impotence of Israeli civil society to change course. In more positive news related to labor in Israel, Democracy Now! Reports Jimmy Williams Jr., president of the International Union of Painters and Allied Trades, says his union is, quote, directing its massive international pension fund to divest from the Gaza genocide, end quote. According to left-wing British outlet Squawk Box, the Painters Union receives $330 million in new contributions from union members each year. The Middle East Monitor reports, quote, Ray Youssef, CEO of the Bitcoin marketplace platform Nunsap, alleges that cryptocurrency giant Binance has seized all funds from all Palestinians as per the request of the IDF. They refused to return the funds. All appeals denied, end quote. Responding to this allegation, a Binance spokesperson claimed that the seizure of assets only covers a limited number of accounts linked to quote-unquote illicit funds, though Binance did not specify the extent or value of the illicit funds involved. Boosters of cryptocurrency, like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., have framed it in terms of quote-unquote transactional freedom, per Axios. Not so for the Palestinians, it seems. Jeremy Corbyn, former leader of the UK Labour Party, has united with 4 other independent pro-Gaza MPs to form the Independent Alliance, per the BBC. This new parliamentary bloc will, quote, use their platform to campaign for scrapping the 2-child benefit limit and against arms sales to Israel, end quote. With 5 MPs in this alliance, it already outnumbers the Green Party and is equal to Reform UK, the far-right party formed by Brexit champion Nigel Farage. In their first move since forming the Independent Alliance, the MPs issued a statement in response to Foreign Minister David Lammy's announcement that the UK will suspend a small number of arms export licenses to Israel. The statement reads, quote, for months, we have called for an immediate and full suspension of arms sales to Israel. The government has finally admitted there is a clear risk of weapons being used to commit violations of international law. This announcement must be the first step in ending all arms used by the Israeli military to commit genocide in Gaza. According to the ACLU of Indiana, quote, Indiana University has approved a new policy that prohibits all expressive activity if it takes place between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m., even if the activity is not at all disruptive, such as standing silently, holding a sign, wearing a t-shirt with a communicative message, or discussing current events with friends, end quote. This policy, which, quote, carries harsh punishments, including suspension or expulsion for students and suspension or termination of staff, end quote, was adopted in response to campus pro-Palestine demonstrations last year. The ACLU of Indiana has already filed a lawsuit to overturn this chilling policy. And at New York University, Palestine Legal reports, quote, in a dangerous escalation of repression, NYU announced new student conduct policies last week that appear to prohibit criticism of Zionism. If implemented, these policies risk creating a hostile environment for Palestinian and anti-Zionist Jewish students and severely curtail free expression. Quote, the statement notes that NYU does not afford protected status to any other political ideology, and that its decision, quote, opens the door for other ethno-nationalist ideologies to claim protection from criticism. With Zionism enshrined as a protected class, there's no reason why Hindu nationalism, Christian nationalism, white nationalism, or similar ideologies wouldn't be afforded the same. End quote. Palestine Legal has vowed that it will, quote, continue to monitor and combat institutional attempts to punish and censor students organizing for Palestinian rights. In a major escalation of tensions, the United States seized Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro's plane in the Dominican Republic and transferred it to Florida, per the BBC. According to this report, quote, U.S. officials said the plane was seized for suspected violations of U.S. export control and sanctions laws, end quote, while Venezuelan officials have denounced this move as an act of quote-unquote piracy, and reserves the right to take any legal action to repair this damage to the nation. Foreign Minister Ivan Gil said the U.S. has justified itself, quote, with the coercive measures that they unilaterally and illegally impose around the world, end quote. This is just the latest case of Western governments seizing Venezuelan state assets. In 2018, the Bank of England seized nearly $2 billion worth of Venezuelan gold and has refused to return those assets despite urging from the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Sanctions, per Declassified UK. The Miami Herald is out with a stunning new report on the dubious Havana syndrome, which finds that patients were coerced to join an NIH study on the supposed illness. According to this piece, quote, an internal review board at the National Institutes of Health decided to shut down a long-term study of Havana syndrome patients that found no signs of brain injuries after several participants complained of mishandled medical data, bias, and pressures to join the research. Jennifer George, a spokeswoman for NIH, said the internal review found that informed consent policies to join the study were not met due to coercion, end quote. Though George insists the coercion was not on the part of NIH, she declined to identify who coerced the patients. Daniel Nashanian of Bolts Magazine reports, quote, Arizona Democratic Senate nominee Ruben Gallego, fresh off of a police union endorsement, just penned a letter to the U.S. Department of Justice asking them to stand down in its investigations against the Phoenix police and its efforts to bring the department under a consent decree, end quote. The proposed consent decree in question stems from a DOJ investigation that found, quote, Phoenix PD uses excessive force, including unjustified deadly force, unlawfully detain, cite, and arrest people experiencing homelessness, and unlawfully dispose of their belongings, discriminates against Black, Hispanic, and Native American people when enforcing the law, violates the rights of people engaged in protected speech and expression, and discriminate against people with behavioral health disabilities when dispatching calls for assistance and responding to people in crisis. Finally, in more positive Senate-related news, a new split-ticket poll shows populist independent candidate Dan Osborne running neck and neck with incumbent Republican Senator Deb Fischer in Nebraska. While Donald Trump leads Kamala Harris 54-37, the same poll shows Senator Fischer leading by only 1 point, 39% to Osborne's 38%, with 23% undecided. Osborne, a union leader who organized the 2021 Kellogg strike, has been favorably profiled by the American Prospect. There is no Democrat running for this seat. This has been Francesco DeSantis with In Case You Haven't Heard.
I want to close the show today by reading some feedback we got on our tribute to the late, great Phil Donahue from 2 weeks ago. This comes off our YouTube channel, and it's from Stephanie Ceresi. And Stephanie writes, if Phil Donahue was the father of the talk show, he was the grandfather of social media. He gave every person access to the greater dialectic, that foundation stone without which there can be no democracy, no republic. And now, with his passing, let us speak of the venerable Phil Donahue's heroic virtue. his stunning mastery of moderating conflict, his courage to confront the biggest issues of the day, even topics forbidden. I can think of few among the marching saints who had as much integrity as Phil Donahue. His career was martyred to the truth when he dared question the Bush administration's motives for the Iraq War and its morality. Donahue was fearless. He called out war profiteers like Halliburton and the conflict of interest of Dick Cheney, chairman and CEO of Halliburton. Phil Donahue made room for everyone at the table, a feat no less miraculous than if Cicero could fit every citizen across the empire into the Roman Forum. I hereby name Phil Donahue the patron saint of journalists, orators, and the First Amendment of the United States. Thank you for that, Stephanie. And that's our show. I want to thank our guest again, Jason Berlin of Field Team 6. A transcript of this show will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
The American Museum of Tort Law has gone virtual. Go to tortmuseum.org to explore the exhibits, take a virtual tour, and learn about iconic tort cases from history.
We have a new issue of the Capitol Hill Citizen. It's out now. To order your copy of the Capitol Hill Citizen, Democracy Dies in Broad Daylight, go to capitolhillcitizen.com.
And remember to continue the conversation after each show. Go to the comments section at ralphnaderradiohour.com and post a comment or question on this week's episode. Join our regular commenters. We've got some great commenters, and we read them all. We don't necessarily like them all, but we read them all.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Hannah Feldman, Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon. Our social media manager is Stephen Wendt.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we welcome Jack Dangerman, author of the new book, The Power of Where, a geographic approach to the world's greatest challenges. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. Keep active, keep reading, keep thinking. You might even get the Capitol Hill Citizen just out, capitolcitizen.com. Spread the word.
Stand up. Oh, you should step up. I think that you